They say evil always has a face. But what if it doesn't? What if it's smiling at the dinner table, doing homework, saying, "I love you" before bed? And what if that same smile, one day, pulls the trigger? This isn't just a crime story. This is a descent into the abyss of a teenage mind torn between shadow and mask, identity and emptiness. This is the story of Carly Gregg. And what you're about to hear may change the way you see innocence. Forever. Because beneath her straight A records, friendship awards, and Golden Girl facade, there was something growing. Something ancient. Something Jung would call the shadow. The dark side of the psyche we all carry. And most deny. But she didn't. And the moment her finger pressed the trigger, the lie collapsed. She was 14. A gifted student. Kind. Polite. The type of girl that neighbors describe as sweet, teachers praise, and parents brag about. But inside Carly's home in Brandon, Mississippi, perfection was a fragile mask. Her father had vanished long ago, swallowed by addiction. Her baby sister had died unexpectedly. Loss, grief, absence. They carved themselves into Carly before she had words to name the pain. And the woman left to carry the weight was Ashley Smiley, her mother. A woman trying to hold the family together with hands cracked by years of silent suffering. They say Ashley was strict, but maybe that's what love looks like when the world teaches you that softness gets punished. But discipline without understanding becomes control. And a controlled spirit, as Jung warned, doesn't disappear. It fragments, it hides, it builds resentment until it erupts. By 13, Carly was already slipping into the margins of herself. She began hiding things. Blades in her room, a secret phone, vapes laced with THC. She lied about piercings, about tattoos. She laughed when caught cheating on tests. But none of it alarmed people. Because she still smiled. Because the mask was intact. That's the problem with modern psychology. It often treats symptoms, not roots. And Carly was treated, diagnosed with depression and anxiety. Put on antidepressants. She told friends they made her feel like a zombie, emotionless, numbed. But no one asked what the numbness was hiding. To Jung, this wasn't just mental illness. It was the beginning of psychic dissociation. When the ego becomes so disconnected from the self that it can no longer distinguish between what is real and what is rage. Then came the morning of March 19, 2024. Ashley had found the vape, the drugs, the secrets, and she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there, in silence. And silence, when charged with judgment, can be more violent than words. Carly went to her room, pulled a .357 Magnum from beneath her bed. And then, 3 shots, to the face, point blank, no hesitation. Her mother collapsed where she stood, blood blooming into the floor tiles. It wasn't chaos, it was calculated. And here's where it gets darker. Carly then texted her stepfather from her mother's phone. "Hey babe, what time you coming home?" As if nothing had happened. What kind of mind does this? A mind that's detached. Not from reality, but from humanity. And yet, not insane. This is where Jung's theory of the persona comes in. The social mask we wear to be accepted. But behind every persona is the shadow. And the more perfect the persona, the more monstrous the shadow becomes. Carly's mask was polished. Her shadow? Starving. And when Ashley confronted her, it wasn't just about a vape. It was about control. About being seen. And in that moment, Carly didn't see a mother. She saw a wall, an oppressor, an enemy. But here's the terrifying truth. After the murder, Carly didn't run, didn't panic. She showed the body to a friend on FaceTime like it was a twisted trophy. She waited for her stepfather to come home, planning to kill him too. And when he arrived, she shot him in the shoulder. He survived. Barely. She then tried to wipe the cameras, hide the gun, erase the scene. But some stains can't be erased. They echo. And now, so does the question. Was this a psychotic break? A side effect of medication? Or something far more ancient, far more disturbing. Was this the shadow, unmasked? There's a moment in every tragedy when time fractures, when the story stops being just about what happened and becomes a question of why. Why did a 14-year-old girl choose to become the executioner of her own mother? Why didn't she break down, cry, scream for help? Instead, Carly stayed cold. She sat in the house, with the body. Hours passed. And when police entered, they didn't find a terrified child. They found calm, silence, and eyes that didn't flinch. That's the kind of stillness that haunts investigators. Not the chaos of panic, but the presence of calculation. They asked her, "Why did you do it?" And she said nothing. Carl Jung believed that when the conscious ego is no longer in control, the unconscious takes over, and the unconscious, unlike us, is timeless. It doesn't care about morality. It moves like a force of nature. In Carly's case, the unconscious didn't just speak. It acted. The detectives combed through her digital footprint, searching for answers. And they found them. Not in confessions, but in patterns. Private journal entries, chat logs, drawings, dark symbols, violent fantasies, fragmented phrases. I feel like I'm not real. Everyone lies. If they knew what I really thought, they'd lock me away. These weren't just the musings of a troubled teen. They were echoes of something deeper, the disintegration of identity. Jung described this as the collapse of the ego's defense mechanisms, when the self, starved of truth, splits into conflicting archetypes: the inner child, the destroyer, the avenger. Carly, in her writing, didn't appear insane. She appeared split, divided. On one page, she praised her mother. On the next, she fantasized about watching her bleed. This duality, this psychic schizophrenia, isn't mental illness in the diagnostic sense. It's mythological. It's the ancient war between light and shadow, raging within the fragile frame of a young mind, abandoned too early, burdened too soon. The prosecution painted her as a manipulative, cold-blooded killer. The defense argued that her antidepressants may have triggered a psychotic break. But the truth lives somewhere in between, and maybe that's what makes it unbearable. Because to accept that Carly knew what she was doing, and did it anyway, forces us to look in the mirror, to ask, how many masks do we wear? How much of our darkness do we deny? And what happens when a child is never taught how to carry their pain? Let's not forget the timeline. In the months before the murder, Carly began rebelling. But this wasn't typical teenage defiance. It was ritualistic. She began cutting, not as a cry for help, but as control. A reclamation of agency over a body and a life she felt slipping away. Jung would say, this is the shadow acting through the body, bypassing the conscious mind, demanding to be felt, even through pain. She also started hiding weapons, not out of fear, out of intent. One friend reported that Carly had once joked, "It'd be easier if people just disappeared." Another said she had recently become obsessed with death. Not in the gothic romantic sense, but in a clinical one. The detachment was total. She was rehearsing for something. But here's the twist. Just weeks before the murder, she posted a smiling selfie on social media, captioned, "Happy to be alive." This is the paradox of darkness. It wears light like camouflage. And it's here that Jung's concept of the persona becomes terrifyingly relevant. The persona is the version of ourselves we project to the world. But when that mask becomes too perfect, too distant from the true self, the shadow grows teeth. In Carly's case, the mask wasn't just polished, it was airtight. And when it finally cracked, it didn't fracture, it detonated. After her arrest, she was evaluated by multiple psychologists. Not one found her insane. Disturbed, yes, but not detached from reality. She knew her rights. She understood time, place, motive, and most chilling of all, she asked one officer, "Will I get life without parole? Not why am I here? Not what will happen to me, but will I be free again?" That question revealed everything. Because Carly wasn't lost. She was calculating. And Carl Jung warned us of this too. When the shadow is repressed long enough, it doesn't disappear. It evolves. It learns how to mimic the ego. how to wear the mask of normalcy, while plotting in silence. The trial was short. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated less than a day. She was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder, attempted murder, tampering with evidence. And she was sentenced to, there's something deeply unsettling about a quiet child with violent thoughts. Not because it's rare, because it isn't, but because society refuses to believe that innocence and darkness can live in the same soul. Yet Carly Gregg forces us to confront that possibility. She wasn't a monster born. She wasn't a stereotype. She was a girl, a daughter, a student. And she was also a ticking time bomb. Somewhere along the way, the system missed the signs, or worse, ignored them. Because Carly didn't fit the mold of a troubled youth. She wasn't failing classes. She wasn't screaming at teachers. She was quiet, polite, invisible. But it's often the invisible ones who carry the heaviest rage. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And what if Carly saw something inside herself that terrified her? What if she looked in the mirror and saw someone capable of harm? And instead of running from it, she leaned in. There's a phenomenon Jung referred to as identification with the shadow, when a person doesn't merely repress their darker nature, but begins to identify with it, admire it, use it as power. This is where the false self dies and the predator emerges. What makes this case even more chilling is not just the violence itself, but the calm calculation behind it. According to police records, Carly didn't act out of panic. She retrieved a firearm, waited for her mother and stepfather, and opened fire. No signs of a struggle, no warning, just shots, deliberate, direct, and final. Her mother was killed instantly. Her stepfather miraculously survived, but barely. And what disturbed investigators wasn't just the crime. It was Carly's demeanor after it. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She didn't try to hide. She simply waited for the consequences, as if she had accepted them long before they arrived. It wasn't passion. It wasn't impulse. It was detachment. This is where the spiritual void enters. Jung warned that modern individuals, especially the young, suffer not just from psychological wounds, but from spiritual starvation. When meaning is stripped from life, when community dissolves, when identity is fragmented by trauma and isolation, the psyche begins to rot, and in that emptiness, the shadow thrives. Carly, by all accounts, didn't believe in God. Not because she rejected faith, but because she never truly encountered it. What she did believe in, according to her writings, was control. Control over her thoughts, control over her pain, control over her narrative. In a world that ignored her, she wrote her own ending. But let's ask the hardest question. Could this have been prevented? Could therapy have helped? Could anyone have pulled her back from the edge? Maybe. But by the time Carly reached 14, the transformation had already begun. The wound wasn't new. It was ancient, buried under years of silence, invalidation, and emotional suppression. Some family members described her mother as strict. Others said she was loving. But in Carly's mind, the mother figure had become distorted. No longer nurturing, but oppressive. This is the archetypal devouring mother, a term Jung used to describe when the maternal figure is unconsciously perceived as smothering, controlling, or life-denying. For a fragile ego, that perception can breed hate, and hate, when given time, becomes ideology. There's something terrifyingly logical about how Carly explains herself. Not in interviews, she rarely spoke to the media, but in her letters from juvenile detention. She wrote to a former teacher, "I used to dream about disappearing. Now I don't have to pretend anymore. There's no one left to lie to. This is not remorse. It's not guilt. It's resignation. A soul that no longer seeks redemption, only silence." And that, perhaps, is the final stage of shadow possession. When Jung spoke of the dark night of the soul, he wasn't talking about sadness. He was describing a full collapse of meaning, a psychological death. In Carly, we see what happens when that death is not followed by rebirth. No phoenix, no transformation, just ashes. She walks the detention center halls now like a ghost. Other youths avoid her. Some say she stares into space for hours. Others say she smiles to herself when no one is watching. But one thing is clear. The girl the world once knew is gone. What remains is a shell, and inside it, a storm that once had a name. This isn't just a story about a crime, it's a reflection of a society that's forgotten how to listen, how to feel, how to reach out before the silence turns deadly. How many more Carlys are out there, right now, wearing masks, smiling, waiting? And how long until one of them decides to stop pretending? Woe life terms, without the possibility of parole. Just 14 years old, sentenced to die behind walls. But some prisons are invisible, and Carly had been living in one long before the verdict. Some stories don't end with justice. They end with questions, echoes, and the haunting realization that we may never fully understand what truly lived behind someone's eyes. The name Carly Gregg still floats in the corners of the internet like a ghost no one wants to summon. Not because people forgot, but because remembering her forces us to confront a darkness we rather deny. That evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it looks just like us. After the shooting, investigators uncovered fragments of Carly's life like pieces of a broken mirror. Her journal entries, her behavior in school, her silence at home. There was no single moment of explosion, just a slow, steady descent into numbness. An inner erosion that began long before the final shot was fired. According to those who studied the case, Carly had no history of violent behavior. No prior run-ins with the law, no gang affiliations, no overt mental diagnosis. And that's exactly what terrified everyone. Because it meant the signs weren't loud. They were quiet, subtle, insidious. She wore the same face as everyone else, but inside, something had unraveled. Carl Jung believed that within every human being, there exists a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious. And when an individual loses connection with the personal, when trauma, neglect, or emotional suppression fractures the ego, they fall into the vast impersonal currents of the collective. It's there that archetypes come alive. The abandoned child, the vengeful shadow, the devouring mother, the tyrant, the martyr. In Carly's case, the shadow didn't just influence her, it consumed her. By the time she pulled the trigger, she wasn't acting as Carly Gregg, the daughter. She was acting as a vessel for everything that had festered inside her for years. Unspoken rage, disillusionment, hopelessness. But what about the aftermath? What becomes of someone so young, so deeply altered, after such a crime? Carly Gregg was sentenced to a juvenile facility, where she remains to this day. Her future is uncertain. Some legal experts speculate she may never walk free. Others believe she could be released in early adulthood, reintegrated into a society that still doesn't know how to process her. But reintegration doesn't undo the past. It doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't rewind the moment when a child became a killer. And no matter what future she's given, Carly will always carry a name soaked in silence and sorrow. This isn't about sympathy. It's about responsibility. Because Carly's story isn't just about a girl who killed. It's about a world that stopped paying attention. We ignore the signs until it's too late. We stigmatize therapy. We dismiss emotional pain as teenage angst. We romanticize resilience and pathologize vulnerability. And then we act surprised when a quiet girl with dead eyes writes the final chapter with a gun. Jung would ask us, not what happened to Carly Gregg, but what happened in us, as a culture, to let it happen. He would see in her a psychic wound made visible, a shadow so starved of light that it erupted. But more than that, he would see a mirror, because the shadow isn't just Carly's. It's ours. It lives in neglected children, in silenced emotions, in the cultural obsession with control over compassion, in every unspoken cry for help that gets lost in the noise. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Carly's fate wasn't inevitable. It was sculpted by years of neglect, repression, and misdiagnosed pain. And if we don't pay attention, this cycle will repeat. Different faces, different names, same silence. So we're left with a final question. Is Carly Gregg a monster? Or a message? A warning? A symptom of a deeper illness that no one wants to name? The truth is, she's both. A girl who committed an unthinkable act, and a reflection of a system that allowed her to disappear, long before she ever picked up a weapon. We want closure. But some stories don't offer it. They just linger, like the sound of a question no one dares to answer. If this story disturbed you, it should. If it made you feel something you can't quite name, that's the shadow, whispering back. So now I ask you, what part of Carly Gregg lives in us all? What rage have we buried? What pain have we silenced? And more importantly, what would happen if we stopped pretending everything is fine? Comment below if this made you feel something you can't explain. Write "I'm still here" if you've ever felt invisible. Because maybe, just maybe, being seen is the first step to healing what the world forgot to save.